Alright, I'm back. So, today we had a impromptu quick tournament at a local pizzeria. And so, time control was 15 minutes with a 10-second delay, which is one of my least favorite time controls because I'm just not very good at that time control. So, with it just being a quick rating, I just usually have fun and just see what happens. So, I didn't do very well because I played some different stuff and made some mistakes and time pressure, but it was fun. So I'm just going to go through quickly and show the games. There's no deep analysis. I'm not plugging the games into an engine or an opening database. It's just, here's what we did, and here are my thoughts during the game. Alright, so in the first game, I was playing white against one of the other club members, Eric, and he's rated about 2050, so he's higher rated than me. I've played him a few times, and I've got a winning record in slow chess, mostly by luck, and in blitz chess. But we've never played quick chess before. Never anything this fast, like 15 minutes. It's always been 5 minutes or at least 45. So I played e4, and he played e6. He plays the French, and I played d4, and he played d5. Now I know that if I play knight c3, he's going to go into the lines with knight f6 and bring it back, and then push c5, and I don't particularly like to face those, so whenever I play him, I usually just play an exchange French of some sort. So we exchanged right off the bat, and I decided to go ahead and get my bishop. And then he played an early c5, and he hasn't played this against me except for in one blitz game. In our slow games where we played the French, he had a few different setups, but this is the first time I've really seen c5 this early from him, except in a blitz game. I've seen him play this setup in the last couple over-the-board games in the club at a slower time control when he was playing other people. So he's been kind of playing around with his response to the exchange French in the last few weeks, last month or so. So I don't really have anything in particular prepared against c5. So I just decided to take it and isolate that queen pawn and see if I could play against that. So we each have our bishop developed, and I just decided to develop normally. Knight f6 from him. I pin the knight. He castles. All pretty standard stuff. I'm going to castle because I don't want my king to get stuck on that e-file. And then he starts kicking my bishop back. He pins my knight. And the exchange French has a reputation for being boring, but in my experience, it has a lot of dynamics, especially at the club level. So it's not really that drawish because people on both sides make so many mistakes. So I'm never worried about going into it. Never worried about a boring game. It's certainly not as exciting as some other French lines, but it still leads to good play. Knight c3. Now I don't know if this was the best or if I should have tried to develop the knight to d2 instead. But I had ideas of attacking this d5 pawn right away, which probably was overestimating my position. I probably should have just tried to play that a little bit slower. He played g4, which ended up being stronger than I expected. My bishop came back, and there's really no way for me to target these pawns, and so his king side's not as weak as it initially looks. So bishop g3, he develops his knight to c6. Notice that whenever his knight develops there, he's not blocking a c-pawn anymore. And I kick his bishop back. And then here, I got a little bit worried about his knight on c6 jumping into one of these squares with this pin still existing on my knight. So I went ahead and brought my bishop back. I also thought, okay, this opens up my queen to attack that d5 pawn, so maybe I can get something going there. Again, probably overestimating my position a little bit. It's not like white has any problems here, but white certainly isn't fighting for some big advantage at this point. Really, what I need to do is play slowly and try to develop a position that can translate into a good endgame where I can use my major pieces such as my rooks against this isolated pawn. Fooling around with the minor pieces like I did in this game really plays exactly to what black wants with an isolated queen pawn. When you have an isolated queen pawn, you want the activity of the minor pieces. And so letting him have that and trying to do the same thing doesn't take advantage of the fact that he has an isolated pawn. So I bring my bishop back to e2, and he plays bishop g6, which is, I think, a pretty strong move. Now that there's no pin, there's really no reason to be on this diagonal. This is also a good diagonal for the bishop, and again, his kingside really isn't that weak with these pawns. There's no way for me to target them. There's no way for me to target this bishop, really. So he has some good space on the kingside, and all of his minor pieces are active. Notice that both his bishops are in powerful diagonals. He plays bishop g6. I go ahead and play a3 because I don't really want his knight jumping in here. And I had ideas of maybe playing b4. So he plays a6, and I go ahead and play b4 to kick this bishop back to a7. So at least now the bishop has on a single diagonal, but it's still lined up with my king. So it's still doing something. And now I decide to kind of try to go in with my knights. Since he has both his bishops backing up the last couple turns, I go ahead and play knight e5, thinking that maybe I can use my bishop on this strong diagonal here. So knight e5, knight takes, bishop takes, and right here I think I'm pretty happy with my position. And maybe I just need to relocate my bishop to here, and again I just need to play it a little bit slower than I did. So he goes rook c8, and now this knight's looking a little weird right there. Maybe I just need to take the time to play the knight over there and not worry about this pawn. But first I play rook c1, and then he goes knight d7, and now I have to make a choice. And here I make a mistake. I go ahead and take the pawn with my queen. So my queen takes d5. He takes my bishop, and I take his knight. And for a split second I was like, okay, this looks pretty good. I've got an active queen, but I missed that his knight jumps, or his bishop jumps back into the game, attacking my queen and my knight. And so here, at this point, I know I'm going to be down a piece. But the other quick game that was going on, they were still playing, and so I figured I might as well play a few moves since we can't repair until the other game is done anyway. So I go ahead and play my queen back, and he takes with the rook, and I play queen g4, and right here he can actually trap my queen by playing h5. So it's pretty funny that my queen ends up getting trapped here. But he doesn't play that. He actually plays the bishop back to a7, and I play my rook, rook fd1. He goes queen c7. I go rook d7, and he goes queen g3. And now I'm just kind of looking to see what kind of counterplay I can come up with. So maybe I can get a couple pieces on the 7th and threaten something over there. But he plays it well. He takes here with the bishop instead of the queen with check. And king f1, queen e3, and at this point I resign. So it was a fun first game. Neither one of us really got in time trouble. We both had about 5 or 6 minutes left in this game, so I was able to keep notation the whole time, partly due to the fact that it was only 26 moves. And most of these games end up being pretty short, but it was a fun one. It was a different exchange French that we'd played in the past, both of us with a lot of activity in the minor pieces, and it just showed that I incorrectly played against that isolated queen pawn. I was going for minor piece activity, and usually I want to aim for major piece activity. I didn't blockade the pawn well, so even though it's a quick game, there are things to learn from. Alright, so that was game number 1. Let's go back, and there's one of these buttons to reload board, and we're gonna go ahead and flip the board. So now I'm gonna play Mark Morelli, and he's someone that I played in a slow game just yesterday. So if you haven't seen the video that I posted going over that slow game, then this game will only be partly helpful, because I'm going to kind of go back to that game from yesterday a little bit, just because we played the same opening. So just the idea that yesterday we went e4 and e6, and we went into a French position where I went out of book in order to kind of throw him off and get what comfortable position as black right from the opening and play a pretty easy game. After we now analyzed that game, once we finished, I showed him this other line that white can play that is relatively good to play against the French and throws people out of the book. So surprisingly, I was a little bit surprised that he decided to play it in this game. So the very next day, he decided to try to utilize it, and he actually played it twice. He played it against me, and then he played it against Eric, who I just showed the game from, and he drew that game against Eric as white in the French. In this game, he ends up winning from a worse position. So it's his first time playing as white against the French with this kind of B3 setup, and it's the first time I've ever faced this. I believe it's the first time I've ever faced this over the board. If not the first, it's one of the first times. I've seen it online a couple times. Yeah, I don't think I've ever played in a slow game from either side. So this was a new experience, and both of us are out of book from move 2. And especially in a quick game, that's kind of fun. Lots of crazy things are happening. As you're going to see, this game heats up real fast and stays exciting the whole way through. So I go ahead and still play d5, and he decides to play bishop b2 and go with the gambit line. So he can also play the knight out or play the pawn up, with ideas of either just playing the bishop here or fianchettoing it and not dropping this pawn. But he decides to gambit it, and I figure, why not take it? Let's see if he can hold on to it. And at the very least, let's see if I can get him to burn some time trying to try to get it back. So I take, and he goes ahead and plays knight c3. So he attacks the pawn right away. I guard it with knight f6. And he attacks it a second time with queen e2. And initially, it looked like he was going to get it back right away. But I found this move, bishop b4. So the knight's actually pinned, because if the knight takes the pawn here, I'm going to actually retake with my knight, and I end up with 3 attackers on this pawn here. And if the queen takes, my queen actually takes with checkmate. So it's interesting. So he can't really go and grab that pawn right away. So after bishop b4, he has to find another way to attack it. First, he gets rid of that mating threat with an early queenside castling. So it's really interesting that he queenside castles when none of his kingsides developed, and all of my kingsides developed, and none of my queensides developed. So I know where his king is from the very beginning. I still haven't decided where my king is going to go. So he queenside castles, and I go ahead and I take the knight. This way, there's no chance of him winning back the pawn right away. Also, since he queenside castled, I wasn't sure exactly how to use my bishop since it was kind of facing the wrong way. So I decided that knight was more valuable. And he took with the bishop, and I went ahead and played queen e7. So notice that he still can't take this pawn, and now I'm going to try and take advantage of his open king right away. Then he played a creative move, g4, just going for my king side. So even though I haven't decided where my king's going to be, I can't really commit to castling queen side because I haven't developed any of my queen side yet. So he pushes g4, threatening to, at the very least, move my knight, which is the only defender of this pawn, and work on these dark squares here. So I decide whether to respond to that or do something else, and I decide I'm going to ignore that threat. I go queen a3 check. He brings the king over, and then I'm going to finally develop my other knight. Perhaps I should have pushed the c pawn before developing this knight, but I was going to see if I can use this knight in the center or attack his king right off the bat, and I didn't want to waste or use another move to move the c pawn because that would give him another move to develop. So right now I've got both knights out, and I want to use those before he really gets a chance to get his pieces mobilized. So knight c6, and he brings the bishop back, attacking my queen, and I bring my queen back to a5. He attacks my queen again. I go back to a3 just to see what he's going to do. So I'm going to repeat the position to give him a chance to do something different with his bishop. He doesn't, and so I come back to c5 this time, eyeing up this square right here, eyeing up c7, which my knight might be able to attack from either of these squares. So his bishop moved back a square, and now I have a chance to attack c7. He develops his other bishop. There are now two attackers on the e4 pawn, but if I don't give him time to take the pawn, then it won't really matter. So I go knight d4. We're hitting the queen, and we're hitting this pawn twice. And so he trades the bishop for the knight, which is kind of forced, and that was my idea, was that now he has a lot of weak dark squares near his king. So queen takes, and also the queen adds a second defender to that pawn. So we're now 14 moves in, and he still hasn't gotten that pawn back. So right now I think black is very happy with this game. At this point, he attacks my knight, trying to remove that defender. And I go knight d5. And at this point, if he's going to take the pawn, it would probably be best to take it with the bishop. But he takes it with the queen, and that's a mistake here, as you're going to see. As soon as he takes it with the queen, I get to play this cool move, knight c3 check. And when he takes the knight, I go ahead and take the rook with check. So at this point, the position should be winning for black. But it's not an easy win. My king isn't safe. I don't have my bishop or either rook developed. So it's not really clear exactly how I go about winning this game. As a result, I'm not going to get quite the time advantage that I wanted. So I bring my queen all the way back to here because I don't want him moving the knight out and developing it with tempo, since his rook is guarded by the bishop. If the knight moves and hits my queen when it was on that square, it would be like a free move. So I just bring the queen back right away. He develops his knight. Makes sense. And then I decide, okay, I'm going to just try and break open the king. Push the a-pawn and see if I can get the rook out that way. Plays knight e5, targeting this weak f7 square. And I just decide that that's not a big threat at this point with only the knight attacking it. And I push a4. He pushes b4, making sure I can't just exchange. And then I go a3. And for a minute, remember this is a quick game, so a lot of the calculations are wrong during the game. I thought he was forced to step up because in my head this rook wasn't there, and so if he stepped back, I would have some kind of mating attack here. But that wasn't the case. He simply steps back here, and the rook guards, and I realized that pushing a3 might not have been the best move. Now, it doesn't really look horrible because at least it pins his king to the back. But maybe I need the castle or develop my bishop or connect my rooks or do something else in order to better my position. Even something like king e7 is something I probably should have considered during this game. So he goes king f1, and I'm saying it's harder to attack his king than I expected. Or I'm sorry, king c1 is what he went. So I castled here, and I think I should have just stepped my king up to e7. He brings the rook over and hits my queen with tempo. And I bring my queen over here. Gonna see if I can find a way to take this pawn, or find some other way to infiltrate towards his king. The real problem is my bishop is stuck, and it's preventing my rooks from getting connected. And his knight does a good job of locking that down. So there's still not a clear plan for me. At this point, he starts pushing his pawns towards my king. I go ahead and take f2. He pushes h5. And I go queen g3. And this position still should be winning without a problem for black. But as soon as he pushes g6, I start having to calculate and figure things out since my king's under attack, and I lose my time advantage. So he doesn't have a lot of time here, only a minute or two, and I had like 4 minutes. But in the next couple moves, we both go down to about a minute or less. Yeah, I think, well, I'll talk about it in a second, where our time is. So I took with the f pawn to open the f file for my rook. He took with the h pawn. And then I played h6. And then he played this move, knight f7. And he played this with about 45 seconds on his clock. I still had a couple minutes, but once he played this move, I didn't know what to do. So we both go down to between like 30 and 45 seconds after this move. And the rest of it ends up being a bit of a time scramble. So I have just enough time that I keep notating for a couple moves. I decide I have to take the knight. And if we look, the real threat is if I do something, I don't know, move the rook up. I didn't like this position here. I just thought I was too open. I didn't like him bring the other rook in. And I might be fine, but I didn't want to go down that road if I wasn't sure. And what I looked at, I thought I would be fine doing this. And I probably was fine if I continued a little more accurately. So once my king takes, he moves check. I go back to g8. And then he moves his rook over here, threatening to bring it down. I go queen g5 check to guard that square. King b1. And then this is where I wasn't sure exactly what to do. So I moved rook a6. And he went queen c4. And at this point, what I need to do is I need to just snap up the bishop, because this actually is not a threat in this position, since my queen actually guards this square. And so now I'm just in a winning position. Now the previous move, instead of moving the rook, I cannot take the bishop because it's guarded by the queen. So once the queen moves away from that bishop, I can take it because I guard against the checks, and my king ends up safe on h7. But instead, with only like 20 seconds on my clock, I go ahead and play rook c6, and this is how the game finishes off. I take... Rook comes down. The rook doesn't come down yet. The queen comes down, and we play a couple more moves, and I end up running out of time. But the position ends up lost. He ends up getting the bishop, and I'm playing the queen against the queen and the rook, and he ends up in a position where he can force the queens off. So it ended up ugly, but it was a fun game. So I was happy to play it, and I didn't realize that it had a name. This opening, this says French defense, Horwitz attack, Papa to call it Gambit, so at least it has a cool name. And I'm excited to play a slow game as black against this in the future, because I expect that's what Mark will choose as a weapon next time he has white against me as black. If he doesn't choose that, that's fine, but I think it would be fun to play in a slow game. It's a very sharp position, and I think that I might use it as a weapon myself against the French, because we have a lot of French players in this area. Now, obviously, people are going to know about it soon if people in the area start playing it, but might be good for a game or two. Alright, so that was game 2. I'm now 0-2. And we go to game 3. So game 3 was against a guy named David, and he's rated, I think, in the mid-1400s for slow chess, but he's quite adept at the faster time controls, quick chess, and blitz. He's better at those than the long time controls. And so I knew he was dangerous. He's beaten me in blitz chess before, rated blitz, and he tends to know the openings well, and so he very routinely gets good positions out of the opening, especially compared to his opponents at faster time controls. So I was hoping to pose just some problems for him. So I played the Scandinavian, and this is, I believe, the first, one of the first times I've ever played the Scandinavian over the board in any time control. So he took it, I took it. I just tried to play some new things today. Knight c3, queen a5, d4, knight f6. So I haven't really played the Scandinavian before, as I said, so I don't really know what to play. I know like the basic moves, but I don't really know the overall plans that much. And so we developed pretty normally. And I know at some point he's supposed to play his knight in to like e4, or no, he plays the knight to d5 at some point, and my queen retreats, and then he goes ahead and doubles my pawns. I know that's an idea, and he doesn't do that, but I was expecting him to at some point. Bishop f5, so he just keeps developing normally. Nothing wrong with white's position here. Knight bd7, and then he attacks my bishop. So this is probably a bit premature for him, I think. As I said, I don't know the Scandinavian that well, so maybe it's fine. And I retreat the bishop because I don't want to leave just the queen guarding it, since he still has the option of chasing my queen away, and then when my queen retreats, the bishop just hangs. And he went ahead and took the bishop right away, which, once he commits the knight to h4, is probably just a good idea, because that knight is bad on h4 if he's not going to take my bishop. And so I go ahead and open the h-file. And then he plays queen e2, which was a strong move that I kind of underestimated. And I played queen e6. And at this point, as soon as I played e6, I didn't like my move. I think he has a chance, to play something like this. He's sacking a piece, but this position really doesn't look that bad for white. My king is stuck in the center. I've got doubled pawns here. My pieces are kind of congested. So I thought he might go for that, or at least he should think about that. But he plays a3 and just continues in a solid position. So I play bishop e7, then he plays b4, bring my queen back to c7, he plays h3, that way I don't have any attacks along the h-file, and then here I make a mistake, I castle kingside. I didn't like how far advanced his queenside pawns were, and where all his pieces were, and so I didn't want to castle in that direction, and I also didn't like that his queen was on the same file as my king. But castling kingside is also not good. In fact, here the sack is even stronger if he takes. Bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes, check. I have to block with the rook. So maybe it's not just winning on the spot, but again, it feels very uncomfortable for me. Not a lot of protection for my king. So during the game, I thought he just won a clean piece by doing that, but I didn't realize my rook guards that. By moving up, blocking the check, and guarding the bishop. But he can just queenside castle or kingside castle, put another rook on the e-file, and it's going to be very hard for me to hold. And so, again, it's something that I think he should at least be considering, even if he's not going to go down that route. So, I castle, and now he castles. I play rook a e8, try and solidify this e-file with all the weaknesses, and then he plays knight e4, and I was happy to get the knights off the board. I want to get the pieces off since I'm not a huge fan of my position here. Queen takes, knight f6 hitting the queen, queen f3, and knight d5. So trying to entice him to trade his bishop pair for the knight, but he does not. He keeps the pieces on the board. And I played bishop f6, just trying to take advantage of this long diagonal here where his rook and pawn are. So knight d5, or bishop f6, and then he plays c4. And c4 was a good move. I wasn't sure exactly what to do with my knight, so I brought it back to e7. and all my pieces are just a little bit passive right now. And maybe black's okay, but white's definitely the one pressing. And he plays bishop c3. And the bishop c3, the bishop on c3 is loose, and so I was trying to find a way to take advantage of that, and I couldn't find anything that could really utilize the fact that he has this bishop and this rook on kind of loose dark squares. Especially since as soon as this light square bishop moves, the queen is guarding that bishop. So I play knight f5, again looking to trade, attacking this pawn a couple times, and he takes, and I took with my e pawn, so I take control of the e file, and now I've got same color bishops, but obviously white's pawn structure is better. But I've got the e file, so I was like, I've got an active rook, maybe I'm okay here. But the problem is that I thought that with this diagonal being covered by my queen, that I might set up some back rank mates, and so I pushed too hard to create tactics to win the game instead of just fighting for equality since he's the one pushing. So I kind of pushed too far, which can often happen if you're playing a lower rated player who's strong enough that they can play sharp positions, is that if you overpress, they can take advantage of that, and that's exactly what happens here. So he plays rook d8. Yeah, rook a d8. And then I play rook d1. And then he plays rook f e8. And then I play rook d... Oh, wait. Whoa, something got messed up. Let's go a couple moves back. He plays... Yeah, he plays rook... Oh, okay. I apologize. He plays rook a e1. So he's trying to trade off rooks because he likes his pawn structure, I'm assuming. And so I move my rook away because I don't want to trade rooks. So I go rook d8, and then he goes rook d1. And then I bring my other rook to the e file. So that was a maneuver to try and get both my rooks active. So if we look in this position here, I have the e file, but my f rook isn't doing anything. And so he's going to try and take the e file, and I'm just going to kind of maneuver to get both my rooks active. Just like that. So fe8, and he goes rook d3, which surprised me. It guards the bishop again. I don't know if exactly what his plan was with that, maybe to double up on that file, but I'm not sure what my plan is, and so I decided just to make a couple queen moves to force him to come up with a plan and see if he's going to create any more weaknesses. A lot of times, especially when you're facing someone that's a little lower rated than you, you want to give them the problems to solve. In this case, I want to see if he can come up with a plan. The problem is that he came up with a plan, and it ended up being a good plan. So I wasted time hoping that he was going to weaken his position, and he took advantage of that time. So he just played stronger overall. So I play queen d6. He doubles up his rooks. I just play my queen back. Again, I don't have a clear plan here. And then he starts rearranging this bishop. And I was like, okay, this is good. He brings the bishop back. Let's see if I can create a weakness on the queen side. And he brings bishop c1. And when he played bishop c1, I thought he'd made a big mistake. But he actually didn't. I thought that bishop c8 was just losing. Or bishop c1 was just losing. So I took the pawn. Because if the rook takes, then my rook takes. And if his rook takes, then I get checkmate. And I was like, this is good. Alright, I've taken that pawn. I should be in good shape. But instead of taking my bishop, he has this nice in-between move, bishop f4, hitting my queen. And so now my bishop and my queen are under attack. There's not a good way for me to deal with it. So I go to b6, and he just breaks off the communication. So after queen b6, he breaks off the communication between them, which was a good move. And so I take, and he takes, attacking my queen. And If my queen takes the pawn, he wins the rook. And so in this position, I can't retreat the queen anywhere to help guard the rook because this bishop's covering the dark squares. And so I have to take here. And then he takes my queen, and I take his queen. And so we end up going into this endgame where, see if I can replay some of it. I stopped taking notation because we're both a bit low on time. And we end up in this endgame where eventually he wins this a-pawn. Actually, I think he just went and got it right now, in fact. Yeah. So he's going to win the a-pawn, and then he's going to push his a-pawn. And I bring my king over and my rook over to help stop that. And I'm able to trade off rooks. And so there was a brief moment where I thought I was okay because my king was over there stopping his pawn. But his bishop, with his pawns, could hold my king down on the queen side. And then his king went over and it ate all the pawns on the king side. And so I marched my c pawn, and I ended up marching my b pawn. But he was able to queen on the h file faster. And as a result, I resigned. So it was a really well-played game by white. It wasn't a great game played by me. I just kind of was passive, played an opening I didn't know, and assumed that he was going to be the one to make a mistake, and he took advantage of that. So after 3 games, I've now lost 3 games. They were a fun 3 games, but I lost all 3. And so now we go to round 4, and I'm not feeling great about my chances. Alright, so in this round I end up playing Mark again. So we ended up having 5 people. One of the guys didn't stay the whole time and I didn't play him. And so I got to play Mark and Eric twice. So my second game against Mark, I was white. I played e4 and he played c5, and I was like, that's right, I didn't want to play e4 because I didn't want to go down the road of playing his accelerated dragon, because normally when I play Mark and he plays the accelerated dragon, he's able to achieve equality relatively easily against me because I don't know the sharpest lines against it. But I also know that he doesn't like to play against the closed Sicilian. So that's exactly what I'm going to play. I've never played it before, especially never over the board in a rated game, but I figured that in a 15-minute game, maybe I'd figure it out. And again, it's another one of those openings where white's kind of forcing black to come up with a plan. And I'm just kind of sitting there with a slightly better position. So knight f3, knight c6, d4, he exchanges, and then he plays g6, and I go ahead and play c4. I don't know the theory behind it or anything like that, but I'm just going to go for a solid position. And he plays bishop g7. I go bishop e3, and then he goes knight f6. I go knight c3, and then he goes d6. So as soon as he plays d6, I see that he's admitting that he's not going to be able to get that d5 break, which is the purpose of c4. So those of you that are wondering, like, why is the closed Sicilian or the Maroczy bind so good against the Sicilian, or in particular the accelerated dragon, it's because in the accelerated dragon especially, black's plan is to get d5 in. And if black gets d5 in the accelerated dragon and a lot of other Sicilian lines, they're very happy. And so c4, the main purpose of that is to prevent d5. And so when you're able to play c4 and get black to admit that they aren't going to get the d5 break in, and they play d6, you know that white's happy. So now, as soon as he plays d6, I decide to change plans a little bit, and I'm not sure how well it works in slow chess or if it's correct, but I decide that I'm going to now try to play it like a more open Sicilian. So I'm going to go ahead and play f3 and push the kingside pawns and force him to defend against the kingside attack right off the bat. I'm even thinking that I'll go ahead and queenside castle. Usually, whenever you play c4 and go for a closed Sicilian, maybe not usually, but often, you end up castling kingside because you don't always pawn storm on the kingside. In an open Sicilian where you haven't played c4, As white, you're going to usually queenside castle and then pawn storm on the king side. So I decided to play c4 and then also pawn storm on the king side. Alright, so after f3, he castles king side. Makes sense. I go ahead and play queen d2, and he plays rook e8. And now I just play h4, just kind of probing the king side. How is he going to respond to that? And he plays e5. Now, I kind of expected him to play e5 at some point. I just don't think e5 is that good because it blocks off the diagonal of the dark square bishop. And as soon as he does that, I decided it's safe for me to go ahead and castle queenside. So I didn't want to castle queenside until he played e5 because as long as that bishop's open, then king's not going to be very safe on the queen side. And I would still have the ability to castle kingside if I wanted to. Once e5's played, I decide it's safe for me to go queenside. So e5, and now it's a decision of where this knight wants to go. I can bring it back to here, I can bring it back to here, and bring it back to here. I decided to bring it back to c2 with the idea that it prevents his knight from coming into b4. So my knight on c2 is just kind of acting as a buffer against any ideas of a queenside attack by him. I thought that if I queenside castle right away and his knight can get the b4 and the queen to a5, he might still get a lot of play even without this dark square bishop. So just bring the knight back to c2 to help defend against that because I didn't see a clear plan for that knight on the king side. If I was going to bring it back to e2, it would be with ideas of pushing f4 and f5. But I decided against that plan on the king side, therefore the knight was better utilized on the queen side. At least that was my thinking. So he goes knight h5. So he's eyeing this weak g3 square. But as you can see, my light square bishop really doesn't have a role at this point anyway. And this knight on f6 is one of the main defenders for black. So I really wasn't worried about it coming in to g3. So I just take this chance to queenside castle. Once I do that, he goes ahead and plays f5, which I thought was a bit ambitious for him. So he's got ideas of pushing this pawn, but again, if he puts all his pawns on dark squares, I'm going to be happy as white because his main piece, the dark square bishop, isn't really in the game. So I'm not terribly worried about that. In this case, as soon as I queenside castle, there was the additional threat that my queen and rook were lined up against this pawn. So I'm not sure if he didn't see that threat or if he decided there wasn't anything he could do about it that was really good. But I think in this position, simply playing a move like bishop f8 really isn't bad because that bishop doesn't have a future on this diagonal anyway at this point. So he might as well reroute that bishop here to guard this pawn, and then at some point he might sacrifice that d-pawn just to open up the bishop and get a queenside attack going. So that's the kind of plan I was expecting right after I queenside castled. But he played the f5 break, which I just think was the wrong plan in this case. So he plays f5, I go ahead and take here, and his queen doesn't really have any good spaces, and he doesn't want to leave my queen there, so he exchanges. My rook takes, and now he plays bishop f8. Only now I don't think it's quite as good, because he's already down the pawn, and my rook isn't likely to stay on this square d6 anyway, because it doesn't have any good targets. It also can't go to this square, and so it's just a decision of where I want my rook to go. I thought about putting it on d5, but in the end I decided to bring it further back. So, oh, we missed a move. I apologize. I was trying to do it by memory instead of looking at the sheet. So once my rook takes, he went ahead and played knight g3 first with tempo, and then I moved my rook over, and then he played bishop f8. Again, I'm not worried about him trading that knight for this light square bishop, because the light square bishop isn't doing anything anyway. It's a little bit annoying that I have to move my rook off the h-file, but if the knight ever moves, it's going to support a nice g4 push by my pawn, and his bishop is too slow to really go after this pawn. And if the bishop ever goes there, I've got options of putting my bishop in between. So now his bishop goes, attacks my rook, and my rook comes down to d2. So I was thinking about putting the rook on d5, but I decided the rook on d2 is useful because if the bishop ever ended up getting traded off or moving, or this knight ever had to go somewhere, I just didn't want the knight to ever have chances of going to e2 with that check and attacking my rook. So yes, that square is already guarded twice, but I'm going to overprotect it because overprotecting that square doesn't hurt my position in this case. So when overprotecting a square that is, especially in a case where that is one of the only squares where your opponent has play, is a good idea if it doesn't weaken your position otherwise. And in this case, I didn't feel like rook d2 was really any worse than rook d5, so why not protect that square in the process? Especially if I'm ever able to push this g-pawn, maybe I can double up the rooks over here. So I thought rook d2 was a potential offensive move and also a potential defensive move. I have my pawn, so why not just secure my position? So rook d2, he goes bishop e6. So he finally gets this bishop active. You'll notice that this is now move 16, and he's just now bringing the light square bishop and now the a rook into the game. Wow, even though my light square bishop isn't really doing anything, all of my pieces have been relatively active. If nothing else, both my rooks are active compared to his at that point. And now he plays now I play knight d5. And I think that the point of bishop e6 is to prevent knight d5, only it doesn't actually prevent knight d5. Another reason I brought my rook all the way back was because I saw the potential for this being a good outpost for the knight. So anytime you see a square of yours, or a square that's guarded by one or more of your pawns, and can't be attacked by any of their pawns, that's a good outpost for your knight. So guarded by one or more of your pawns, and can't be attacked by any of their pawns. So notice that his pawns are either gone or past the d5 square. Therefore, that's a square I want to look to get a knight to. So I go ahead and place the knight right there. Yes, he can trade off his bishop, but in doing so, I'm going to get a lot of play. So he's got to decide how to respond to this very strong knight, and it's going to be replaced by a very strong passed pawn if he trades it off. So he takes, and now I've got to decide which pawn to take with. Initially, it looks like I should take with the e pawn, because if I take with the c pawn, then the e pawn ends up kind of weak, being attacked by this pawn and the knight. But because I'm hitting his knight with tempo, he really doesn't have time to take that. And as soon as his knight moves, I'll go ahead and put my bishop here perhaps, or I'll just start pushing this pawn, and it's going to be hard for him to respond to. In addition, this knight does not really have any good squares to go to. Remember, this square it can't really go to without me trading it off, which I wouldn't be opposed to. It brings his bishop into the game, but it gets rid of this knight, and I can go ahead and start pushing that pawn. So, instead of doing that, he tries to take here. And it was just a case of a tactic that didn't work out. He thought he was going to get enough tempos to compensate for the piece, but as soon as I took the knight and he realized that he wasn't really attacking anything too meaningful, he went ahead and resigned. So here you can see, you know, black's pieces are pretty passive. I've got the open file with a good bishop, and I'm up a piece. It wasn't really worth playing on. So that was another one where we didn't really get into time pressure, and it was only 19 moves, but yeah, I ended up with a good position. And this game made me think perhaps I need to look into the closed Sicilian more. I've never played the closed Sicilian before because I really like open games, and so I just enjoy playing the open Sicilian, and I've had great results with the open Sicilian against players at all levels, but against people I know play the Sicilian a lot, or I know play certain lines of the Sicilian that I don't like, perhaps this is a weapon that I can add to my repertoire. So that was game 4, and I have one more to show you. So in game 5, I went ahead and I played Eric a second time. So I'm now 4-1, and I wasn't really worried about winning or losing games, but it was nice to win at least one. So at least I didn't go winless. So in the last game I played Eric, and this time he had white. So he was the same person I played in the first game. So he played e4, and I decided to play something different. Just trying to... Yeah, okay, so he played e4, and I've already played... Okay, so in the first game, Eric played a French against me. In the second game, I played a French. In the third game, I played a Scandinavian. In the fourth game, Mark played a Sicilian. So this time I decided to play, again, something new. So I played c6, went into a Caro-Kann. I never played the Caro-Kann. I don't particularly like the Caro-Kann. I enjoy playing against it, but I wanted to play something different. And Eric and I have played lots of Frenches. Since we're both French players, every single game, blitz, quick, standard, long chess, slow chess, fast chess, every single game has been a French. So I decided to switch it up. He plays d4, d5, and it became clear to me right away that he knew his Caro-Kann pretty well, and I was just basing this off of a few games that I played against the Caro-Kann. So I think I played the opening relatively well. Bishop f5, knight g3, and this is a really sharp line. And I don't think I got in a huge amount of trouble, but he definitely came out with a comfortable position. And I didn't really have a plan. So again, we're seeing that without a plan, that's whenever problems really start. Especially in these faster time controls, plans are especially important, because if you don't come up with a plan, and then you're forced to when you aren't expecting to, it really eats up the clock. Knight f6, bishop d3, and so this is all main line. It may look weird for white to willingly trade off their good bishop, but it's an important diagonal, and his bishop's replaced by the queen. So it's standard play for the Caro-Kann. Queen takes bishop, and then at this point I don't really know what black's plan is, so I go knight d7, goes bishop d2, which I don't know if that's the main move. I thought that often the bishop goes here and the knight comes in here, but bishop d2 ended up being fine. I played e6, he queenside castled, and I know that when white queenside castles, that's usually the sharpest way to play against. And then I went queen b6, and queen b6 was probably a mistake, because they're going to end up being a lot of tactics along this file right here. Queen b6, and he goes knight e5, and so I exchange off, and knight d7, and this is an interesting situation because if the bishop moves, he has a double attack on my knight, and it's actually with checkmate. So if he can move the bishop to a square that attacks my queen and threaten checkmate, things look really good for him. So I knew that this was a critical position, and he took his time here. So one thing I thought that he might do is he can do queen takes knight, and when I take back, he can play something like bishop here with check. And then we end up like in a position like this. But I thought that the material came off the board and he didn't get enough for it, and he didn't go for that line. I also, the line that he was really looking at was bishop a5. And if he plays bishop a5, what was it that I was going to do? I think I was thinking I can get knight c5, and then if bishop takes queen, knight takes queen, rook takes, and here, and again, we end up with a position that looked really sharp and suddenly simplified, and white doesn't have a ton for it. So he doesn't play either of those lines where the queens end up coming off the board, which probably was the right decision. So instead, he plays f4, which, while f4 doesn't actually threaten anything, there's not really a clear plan for black. So I queenside castle just to get rid of those threats. He goes bishop e3, attacking my queen. I go bishop c5. We trade off bishops. And I take with my knight, attacking his queen. and his queen goes over to a3. And after a3, here I make a mistake and I move my king to b8. Instead, if I want to go down the road I end up going down, I can play knight a4 now, is kind of the idea I was looking at. And then with the idea that if he goes queen takes, I'm going to end up with this check, and I'm going to have a fine position. Or at least I think my position's okay. Maybe it's not the best, but if I'm going to play knight a4, that's what I want. And if he plays here, then I play here, and then if queen takes, we end up with like some position like this, where the knight comes back. I get some pawns, and in these positions I've given up the piece, but I've gotten a couple pawns for it. I've got an active queen, I've got a good rook, and so I've got some potential. But instead, what I do is I still go with that plan, but later, once he's already established enough. So I play king b8, which moving your king a step over after queenside castling is often a good idea, but that doesn't mean you should do it without thinking. So it's often a good idea, but that doesn't mean you can just do it without thinking. In this case, my king on the c-file actually was doing important things, like guarding the d8 square and guarding the d7 square, preventing him from infiltrating. I thought that the a7 square might be important, so I wanted my king to guard that so my queen was free to roam, but the d7 and d8 squares were actually more important in this position. So when I go I go king b8, and this just allows him to infiltrate. So the rook comes in, and I don't want to trade rooks because I can't really stop his pawn then. And so now I go for this knight idea. I'm like, well, we'll just go all in, but now it's not as good. So he goes here, I take, queen takes, check. He brings the knight back, I take f4. He plays rook f1, and I still think I'm okay here, or I thought I was okay in the game. Like, in my head, I thought I was okay, but I actually wasn't. Because when I play queen g3, I didn't realize that he's going to be hitting things with so much tempo. So, notice that he can't threaten mate because I actually have checkmate myself. And that was kind of one of the threats I was looking at, is that I don't have to worry about the f-pawn because I'm threatening checkmate if that rook moves. But he has this nice move, queen d4, threatening to win my rook and opening a square for his king. And now I realize that I was probably just in trouble. So I have to save the rook, and now he can go ahead and take f7, threatening to double up on the d7 square. With this rook coming down, and he's doubling up on the 7th rank. Notice that these threats are on d8 and d7, squares that were previously guarded enough times if my king had remained on c8. But as soon as I move my king open, those squares become the weakness that loses the game. So I go ahead and attack his queen, so just desperado here. And it's interesting because he can try to so one thing that looks tempting is to go here, threatening checkmate, but this doesn't quite work because I can go check, but then he can bring back the check, and then I guess, yeah, so maybe he can do that too. We were both under some time pressure here, so we were trying to figure out, okay, what wins for white, and so one option was to just move the rook down. But obviously that looks more dangerous because it just kind of leaves the queen in the air. And so instead he plays queen e4. Notice that that's threatening checkmate also. And I went ahead and I threatened his king. And his king, I believe his king stepped over here. And then, yeah, his king stepped over here. And then I played the queen back, which obviously just loses the queen, so that wasn't a good move. But here it's pretty hard for me to stop checkmate. Instead, probably the best thing I can do is to either offer to trade queens and go into a losing endgame, or offer to trade rooks and go into a losing endgame. So both of those are not great options. If we go back to here, if you look, I can't actually play the rook here to try and prevent these 7th rank threats, because he has this nifty little checkmate. Oh wait, no, because my rook can come back, so maybe I could have done that there. I don't know, it's interesting. This is actually, I just looked over the game now, and obviously in a 15-minute game you don't see everything. So maybe I was okay to do that. Instead of playing the queen over check. That being said, it's still losing at that point. So at this point, everything's losing. It's just a matter of me trying to find a way not to lose. And by pushing the pawn here, c5, I'm at least giving him some chances to mess up. Especially if the queen comes back. Like if the queen comes back to here, again we have this checkmate. So I'm just trying to give him chances to mess up. Although it didn't really matter. He found a good move, and then I went away and gave up the queen. Just wasn't paying attention, and it didn't really matter. I was under time pressure. It was a losing position. If I take, it's checkmate here. So I ended up losing that game, but I had fun. 5 quick games at 15 minutes aside with 5-second delay. So I'm looking forward to playing that more, and I've got to find a way to get better at that time control, because I'm rated pretty well in slow time controls, and I'm rated pretty highly in blitz, but this faster quick time control, 15 minutes or so, I'm really bad at over the board, and I'm really bad at online. So I don't know what it is about 15 minutes that's giving me problems, but perhaps I just need to play more. I know USCF has tournaments Friday night online on chess.com, so maybe I'm going to have to check that out and try and play in more of those to try and get practice, because I expect I will need to play more of these in the future, since it seems like people like it. Alright, well, have a good day, and I hope you enjoyed the video.